It is time for another episode of One Soccer Today, presented by CIBC for this Thursday, July the 13th. Gareth Wheeler, Oliver Platt, and yours truly, Adam Jenkins. World Cup is just around the corner. They are ready to get their tournament underway in Australia, and they'll begin against Nigeria. But let's zoom out a little bit, talk big picture. Looking for optimism and then a little bit of pessimism. But let's start where it deserves to be, and that's the optimism, Oliver Platt. Give me one reason, just one, could be a big reason, could be a little reason, why you think this women's national team could win the World Cup.
I only do big reasons, Adam. But the reason for me would be that this seems to be a very unsettled and unpredictable tournament, right? Just in terms of the way that the top teams are going into it, in terms of form, in terms of obviously a ton of injury problems to some of the most high-profile players in the world. And so maybe it is a tournament that is ripe for a team to spring a few surprises, to be like Canada were in Tokyo, very defensively solid, very difficult to break down, frustrate opponents. And it could be a tournament that's prone to something like that. I can't sit here and say honestly right now, based on what we've seen over the past couple of years, that I think Canada is the most talented team in the world, that they're going to go toe-to-toe with everyone in this tournament and beat them. But we do know that they can grind and they can defend and keep clean sheets. And that, I think, is probably the pathway. They've got to show more, I think, going forwards than they have done to have a chance here. It's a harder tournament, a longer tournament. But that, I think, is going to be the blueprint. And maybe some of the opposition might be a little bit more vulnerable to that than they ordinarily would.
Gareth?
Jenkins, because anything's possible.
Thank you, Kevin Garnett. Thank you.
And they've done it before. Like, there's a reference point here. And when it comes to tournament football, I thought that Bev Priestman got virtually every call of hers right in Tokyo. So there's a clear reference point. She's going to have to manage the squad appropriately. And only she knows, in terms of how she's working with these players, what roles are best for each one of the players in the team. And I think it's going to take some big calls for her to make in order to get the most out of this group. Of course, the strong defensive players certainly help, but I think Bev Priestman's the key here. And the fact that she's done it before, I think it provides a good framework for this team to succeed in this tournament as well.
As is often the case, I agree with both of you, but I think something that a lot of supporters of this team will agree on, and this is probably the biggest thing for them heading into this tournament for the reasons you both outlined, they have to get back to their solidity at the back. That has been absent the last 4 or 5 matches from them going back to the She Believes Cup. No more silly defensive mistakes, center backs and goalkeepers. Play it safe, play it really simple if it needs to be at times, but that has to be the hallmark for this team, and there can't be any excuses there if they want some success. Ollie, I'm going to bounce it back to you, and I'm going to outlaw your ability to use the same answer and just reframe the question. One reason why Canada can't win the World Cup.
I would never do that. I think for me, just looking at the pathway, like that's the big one I look at in terms of how difficult this is going to be. It's a bit unusual, this tournament, in the sense that the teams from the same group are on the same side of the draw in the knockout stage. Yeah. So we've talked a lot about, if Canada doesn't win the group, they'll play England in that round of 16. Well, even if they do win the group, they're still going to have England in all likelihood at some point, in addition to France potentially in the quarterfinal, or Brazil if they were to win that group as well. So even though if they have that, if they're able to win the group, which is not going to be an easy task in itself, even though they have that maybe easier round of 16 game as a result of that, quarterfinal, semi-final, it's going to get really difficult, and you're probably going to need to beat 3 of the best teams in the world through those last 3 rounds to win the World Cup. So do we think Canada can do that? I think it would, obviously at this point, based on form over the last few years, it looks like a big ask. So let's hope so, but it's going to be really difficult, I think.
One reason why they can't win the World Cup, because anything's possible. Oh, yeah, don't use the same answer. The pathway doesn't bother me, because you're kind of not sure where they'll finish in the group. And Canada in the Olympics, they went the hard way. They did the hard way.
Yeah, they did.
Still the United States and Sweden on the way. So that doesn't bother me as much. I just questioned the attacking quality in this team and the reliable sources of goals. Like, they rode their luck at times, winning penalties, scoring set piece goals. That's kind of what took them there. It wasn't because they were a free-flowing team in attack. It was rather pragmatic and rather cagey at times. And I think the fact that there was no crowds, like there was no one there, kind of played into Canada's favor. Like some of the games just kind of felt lifeless. It was a real slog. Here, there's going to be real atmosphere. And I think that teams that are a little bit more brave from an attacking perspective are going to be rewarded like they weren't in the Olympics. And I just think it's an area, the field, where Canada far too many questions and far too few answers to make me feel confident in this team.
Okay, the World Cup begins on Wednesday, July the 19th, Australia time. I should say New Zealand time, because the tournament kicks off in Auckland at Eden Park. And then Canada gets underway the day after, match 4 of the tournament. Group B, Canada and Nigeria. It starts at midnight if you are in Newfoundland and Labrador. So set your calendars accordingly. Let's talk about John Herdman, because speaking of Bev Priestman grabbing headlines with her bit of banter, John Herdman also grabbed headlines, but for an interesting reason. He sat down with Neil Davidson, post Gold Cup, post Nations League. Canada, of course, losing to the Americans twice. We know that story. But usually we hear from John Herdman and the men's national team in general about the brotherhood, about camaraderie. So when John Herdman said that he felt that the Nations League pressed a little bit of a reset, or after the Nations League, pressed a little bit of a reset button of the culture of the team. What was your reaction to that comment from John Herdman, Gareth?
A little confused, but I understand it to a certain degree. You just wonder why that's come about or why that's come up. I think I have a little bit of a theory. Rather than the players being in camp, I think it's about kind of the makeup of the group and what John Herdman is best at. And for me, Herdman is best at motivating. He's a builder, right? He brings people together with a common goal, and he's outstanding at that. Once the Canadian men's team arrived and were going to the World Cup and then went from underdog to favorite, and some of his players are playing at a higher level not seen before in terms of Canadian soccer, I think it changes the game a little bit. I think that the focus changes. I think that the needs of the players change. And once some of those players weren't there at this Canada camp, it was back to basics. All these new players coming in, a group of them, 7 of them uncapped, I believe. And he went back to what he did before, which is bringing the team together, showing the ropes, preaching the brotherhood, all of these things that he does well as a motivator. So I think that that's what he kind of meant in terms of being a cultural reset. I don't think it was a shot towards any player. I think that it also reflected in the way that they played. They were much more comfortable in that final game against the U.S., being, bullish defensively and going to play on the counterattack. So I think they got back to what Herdman himself really strives at and what he's really good at. It's a much more difficult job now than it was before. I think with some of these top players that are in the team, and there's going to have to be some kind of evolution as well over the next few years. But that's what I think he meant, back to basics with a lot of the new players coming into camp.
It's an interesting comment to make. Sorry to be Captain Obvious here, but saying that it's a little bit of a reset button for our culture implies that you kind of needed to press the reset button on the culture, which would be an interesting implication, I think, for Herdman to make about the Nations League team versus the Gold Cup team and the different personnel there. What I will say is that to that kind of point a little bit, I did think that the differences between the Nations League final and the Gold Cup quarterfinal game, I didn't think that the Nations League final Canada lost because of tactical reasons, really. I know some people would disagree with that and didn't like the approach to that game. But to me, it was a lot more about certain fundamentals that Canada just didn't really produce on the day. I thought the Gold Cup quarterfinal game, even though the team on the pitch obviously didn't have the same level of quality, I thought there was a lot more physicality in the performance, a lot more just juice generally in terms of their willingness to compete, to go for challenges, to run. Set pieces were at least in the initial part of the game before some of the subs were better and were more of a threat for Canada rather than a massive vulnerability. So there were some things there where I think maybe Herdman maybe wanted to make a point. I'm speculating a little bit there. But just going off of these comments a little bit, I thought it was a little bit pointed towards maybe some of the things he didn't get in that final as opposed to what we saw on Sunday.
Well, anything that we offer here is really pure speculation. But the one thing that did stand out, and none of us were there in Las Vegas, but Andy and KJ, I believe, reported and said that some of the players, a couple players, didn't go and huddle up when they were down 2-0 at halftime.
Yeah.
There's a couple players that stayed out of it. So I have no idea what happened in camp. Whether a reset was needed just to get back to what it's about playing for this Canadian team. They've been through a lot. There's a busy schedule, the off-field stuff. It's just, I think it's been a lot. And in this tournament, with maybe some more impressionable players, I think that maybe from his perspective, he could put his stamp on things a little bit more. Things might have slowed down a little bit. So I don't know where to take that. To be honest with you, when I read it, I said, but then I was trying to think of things from his perspective. And for him, it probably was a little bit of a reset. I'm not sure that applies for everyone in the group, Ollie, but for John, probably it was a little bit of one.
Yeah, and that's kind of the other part of it. I think that's worth mentioning is that the off-field stuff has gone on for a long time, and I think it's worn on men's players and women's players. And I think as much as it can sometimes seem like players against, outside things or the federation or whatever, I think it probably has tested the players themselves in terms of their relationships with each other as well, because you're not going to see, not everyone is going to have the same uniform view on these things, right? There's going to be differences within the group as well. And that's probably been challenging, I would say. So there's a lot of things that I think can pile up and just put you in a situation where maybe you need that reset, like Herdman said.